ברוכים הבאים לפסטיבל דוקולייב. יש לנו העונג והכבוד לארח הערב את הסופר פול אוסטר, בעקבות הסרט פול אוסטר דיאלוג, סרטה של סבין לידל. אורך השיחה שלנו יהיה בערך חצי שעה. כל מי שנמצא כאן מוזמן לשלוח לנו שאלות דרך תיבת השאלות והתשובות, ה-Q&A שנמצאת פה למטה. ואנחנו נשתדל להגיע אל השאלות האלה לקראת סוף השיחה. Welcome to דוקולייב. I am גילי, איזקוביץ, and I'm so honored and pleased and deeply amazed to have this talk with author Paul Oster. He's with us in this webinar, and we will talk following the screening of the documentary about him. Paul Oster, What If? And the documentary is about Mr. Oster and also about the 4321, or maybe 1234, which is the great novel he wrote and was published in 2017 and last year here in Israel. The book is about Archie Ferguson, but not only one Archie Ferguson, but four. The book is it follows his life, his early life and childhood during the second half of the 20th century. But we have four versions of the same Archie Ferguson, and every version is a bit different. And this book is also about, is a novel of ideas and is an ars poetic book. And it is very tempting to think of Archie Ferguson as a version of Paul Auster. But Paul Auster says in the movie and in interviews, he's not the same person, although he gives him the same year of birth and the same place of growing up and living. And that's not the only thing, Mr. Auster, that is combined with the two of you. You also gave Archie Ferguson one of the most important life events you had. And I'm talking about what happened to you when you were 14. And I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about this experience and what happened to you?
Yes, I can. And thank you for having me. I'm talking to you all from Brooklyn in New York City on a cold, wet day in late October. Yes, the book it's not an autobiographical novel. And to prove it, it's very simple. I haven't had four lives. I've only had one life. And, but it's about the period I grew up in and the place I grew up in. And I mean, Ferguson has certain resemblances to me, but none of his experiences are the same as mine, except one or two that I stole from my own life. Apart from that, no. But I think the motivating force of the book, the reason why I wrote it, was because of this experience you're talking about. I was 14 years old. I was at a summer camp in upstate New York, and on a hike with about 20 other boys and a couple of counselors. We were in the woods, and we were caught in a very severe lightning and thunderstorm, an electric storm. And one of the boys was hit and was killed, and I was right next to him when this happened. And it was, I suppose, the most important thing that happened to me in all the years of my growing up, because I suddenly understood that the ground I was walking on for all these 14 years was not as solid as I thought it was. It was, in fact, very unstable. And that the line between life and death is almost invisible. And that from one second to the next, a young boy can be breathing and living and smiling and then be dead the next second. And I understood that anything can happen to anybody at any time. This was a deep revelation to me, and it shook me up. And I've been thinking about this ever since. I wrote about it once in a short nonfiction piece in a book called The Red Notebook. But I wanted to use this experience as the foundation of a much larger work. And if nothing else, 4321 is large. It's almost 1,000 pages long. I never thought I could possibly write anything of that length, but it happened because in effect it's 4 novels in one book, the 4 rotating stories. So yes, that was a fundamental experience. And in the novel, in effect, it happens twice. Mm-hmm. To one of the Fergusons, but not in the same way that it happened to me in real life. One of the Fergusons is killed early in the storm, but under different circumstances. And then in another cycle of the novel, one of the Fergusons witnesses the death of a friend of his, mm-hmm. not from a storm, but from a brain aneurysm. He collapses and dies. And this is the jolt that changes his life in a way similar to the way my life had been changed. But that's the only autobiographical component, really. The rest is made up. I take certain things. I mean, just to pursue this line of inquiry for a second, it's true that my mother, for example, Mike Ferguson's mother, for a very brief period, she worked as a photographer's assistant in Manhattan when she was about 20 years old. But then it only lasted a few months, and she married my father, and photography was no longer a part of her life. But in my novel, I take that small little kernel of an idea and turn Ferguson's mother into a real photographer, someone who advances into a real profession as a photographer. So things like that, you know, there's perhaps an autobiographical origin, but the way it plays out has nothing to do with what happened in the real world. It's a book of the imagination, finally.
But I do want to ask another question in that direction, because you did wrote in the Red Notebook about it, a nonfiction part, but then you decided to take this this memory, this experience, and to put it into prose. So I want to claim that you went through something before writing 4321 that made you cling to that memory and turn it into prose. And it's a huge part of the prose. I mean, every time you go in the book to the blank page of Ferguson 2, you are reminded of that arbitrary of life and death. And I want to ask you, what happened in your life before writing 4321 that made you go back to childhood, that made you look into the early life of the characters?
Well, nothing specific, but you see, okay, when I think of the work I've done in this decade, the decade starting in 2010, around then, I wrote 2 novels. Maybe one of them was published in 2009, I can't remember. 2 novels, Invisible and Sunset Park. Mm-hmm. And then I followed those with 2 other books, which were autobiographical books, real autobiography. One is called Winter Journal, and the other is called Report from the Interior. Mm-hmm. These 2 books, especially the second one, but in parts of the first as well, for the first time as an adult, I really started examining my childhood and thinking about it seriously. And I think those 2 works, plowed the ground for a desire to explore childhood even more fully in a work of fiction. So those books were the preparation. There's no question about it. But there was no event in my life that I can think of that inspired me to write any of them. They just came naturally. It seemed to be, it's hard to know where books come from, really. I've never been able to pinpoint anything. Why? And why this story and not another story? Why this particular book at this particular time? It remains a great mystery to me.
Maybe it has something to do with the age you started writing.
Well, I think getting older, certainly, you begin to think about the distant past in ways that you don't when you're 30 or 40 or even 50. But when you get older, the past takes on a different color than it had before. I can remember, for example, when my grandfather was dying, my mother's father, and I was taking care of him. This was in 1979. He was 85 years old. And I was spending, every day in the hospital with him during those last days. And most often when I came in to see him for the visits, he would just tell me he's lying in bed. He's only days away from death. He said, I've been lying here thinking about my boyhood days in Toronto when my brother Archie and I, that's where I got Archie from. That was my grandfather's brother, my great uncle Archie, who was a barber. He cut people's hair. But he was a wonderful man. And my grandfather was older than Archie. And he said, I remember they lived in a Jewish neighborhood in Toronto. And as you know, there were many, Orthodox Jews there. And on the Sabbath, of course, they didn't do anything physical, and they would hire kids to turn on the lights for them and do things like that. He and his brother had those jobs when they were kids, and it was all coming back to him vividly. He had never talked to me about any of this stuff, but that's what he was thinking about in his last days. And I think it's a common feature of aging, is to begin going back to the beginnings of your life. It takes on a new glow.
Siri says in the movie, she talks about the change in your writing, from writing about people in solitude, lonely people, to writing about how society makes a person. And in 4, 3, 2, 1, is it 4, 3, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 3, 4?
No, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's like the countdown for a moon launch.
And so she says it's the edge of this change. Do you think there's a reason for this change? What did anything is anything different in your writing now?
Yes, I think of course it's different. My writing continues to evolve. I think if you're any kind of an artist, whether you're a painter or a composer, anything, a writer, a filmmaker, the work evolves. It has to work. It has to change, because if you keep doing the same thing you did when you were 20, when you're 70, I think something's not working. So you're not growing. And so of course I'm open to all kinds of changes, and I always feel whenever I start a new book that I'm beginning from the beginning all over again. That whatever I've written in the past doesn't mean anything. It's all gone, and I feel like a beginner. And because each book is different, each book places different demands on the writer. Each book has its own music and tone, and as you write the book, you have to teach yourself how to write that book. This is the great adventure of making art. There are no rules to it. There's no formula just to plug in some wires and everything is going to start working. No, it's a slow, organic process, and it evolves in its own time. Some books I've spent 15 years working on and off. Other books I've written in a year. everything it's always different. And I never know what to expect.
Because in my wild imagination, my wild journalist imagination, it had something to do with something you say, I think a couple of minutes after that quote from Siri in the movie, in the film. And you talk about how every artist has a trauma, and happy people can't be artists. So I thought to myself, maybe now you understand your own trauma better and you can write and elaborate about it.
No, because trauma suggests unconscious material that you don't really know what is haunting you. But I've known all along since I was 14 that this event haunted me. There was never any ambiguity about it. It was clearly a turning point in my life. It just took me all those years to finally plunge into it fully and try to explore all the consequences of that event. But I suppose I have other traumas too. I mean, we all have more than one, I would think. But I think I've always felt, that people live in a society, and yes, if some of my characters were isolated in the beginning, it doesn't mean that I wasn't aware of where they were and what was surrounding them. But early on in my fiction writing, I think consciousness was a very important subject for me, something to explore. I mean, how the human mind works. And as I got older, other things began to preoccupy me. I mean, there was a period when I was in my 50s, I wrote a number of books about older men, men who were suffering physical disabilities of one sort or another, or illnesses, and then I seem to have come to the end of wanting to explore that realm anymore, and suddenly young people began to interest me more, because even the two novels before the two autobiographical works, Sunset Park and Invisible, are about young people in their early 20s. So I guess I was working my way back. And then you see in 4321, the story of the Fergusons begins when they're babies, and they all end by the time they're in their early 20s. It doesn't go beyond that, because I do believe the first 20 years of a person's life are the most important period. I mean, we go from a little helpless infant who can't do anything for himself or herself. You're absolutely at the mercy of your mother, your parents. You have to be taken care of. And the astonishing rapid development that goes on, not just even in the first year of life. You go from being a blob to a little person who can walk around and start making sounds and learn how to speak within usually another year or so. And by the time you're 20, you are who you're going to be. You're not completely formed yet, but you know a lot more about yourself than you did even 3 or 4 years before that. And the rest is just the elaboration of those initial formations, and then our lives go on and we become adults, and for better or for worse, but there it is. So I concentrated on the first 20 years.
Okay, let's talk a bit about current affairs and politics. I know that the first name of the novel was supposed to be Ferguson, and you decided to not call it Ferguson after the death of Michael
Brown.
Yeah, in Ferguson, Missouri.
Yes.
And then you thought about how history repeats itself, or it's in a non-ending loop. I mean, history is the big riots of 1968 are happening again. That time it was because of the death of the murder of Martin Luther King, and now it's because of the death of George Floyd. So tell me a bit about America from your eyes.
I just want to clarify this. There were not riots in America over the death of George Floyd. There are a few places there were some violent actions, but only a few. There were 2,000 towns and cities in which protests took place. Mm-hmm. These were the biggest, most sustained protests in the history of the United States. And 99.999% of all the activity was absolutely peaceful. And a lot of the violence, I have to say, was caused by right-wing provocateurs. This was not the demonstrators. So it's very complicated. And we were not living through a period in the spring and summer of anarchy in the streets of America. Donald Trump would like you to think that, but that's not true at all.
It echoes in current Israel. The things you say now echoes a lot in current Israel. And I would love to hear from your eyes what you think about current America.
Current America is in a very, very precarious position right now. We are facing an election that is, as everyone says, but everyone is right, it's the most important election we've had in over a century. For reasons I could never fully understand, Donald Trump managed to be elected president through the crazy system America has of an electoral college. So even though, of course, he lost the popular vote by 3 million, he managed to squeak out just enough votes in a few states to win the electoral college vote. All right. He was president. It was a tremendous shock to me because I knew this man to be a fraud, an incompetent brute without any feeling for political life, but no feeling for the society he lived in. He's one of the most selfish men who ever walked the earth. He's been a disaster. The 4 years in which he's been president and the Republican-controlled Senate has been in power have devastated the United States. The entire government has been gutted. It barely exists anymore. I mean, just yesterday, they were firing more scientists, in the environmental wing of the government and replacing them with political hacks who deny climate change, global warming. We're veering towards a kind of authoritarianism, which is veering very closely towards some kind of fascism. If Trump wins, if somehow he manages to stay in power, I truly believe it's the end of America as everyone has understood it. It will be the end of America as a democracy, and it will be the beginning of something truly, truly frightening, in which a few people have taken over from the many, and it'll become a dictatorship. And it will have terrible consequences here, but everywhere in the world. That's why the election is so important, and that's why even I, who have not been active politically, I've been very engaged in terms of following things and over the years, and I've occasionally written something that seemed urgent to me to write about, some particular political case at the moment over the years. But now, for the first time, my wife and I, Siri and I, we helped found a group called Writers Against Trump. There were 7 of us to begin with. Now there are 1,800, I think. And the numbers keep expanding. And our mission has been to encourage people to vote, particularly young people, particularly people who are on the left and decided not to vote because they don't think Biden-Harris is a strong enough ticket. And in a kind of youthful idealism, these young people have decided the pure, better thing to do is not to vote. Little understanding that not voting is in effect voting for Trump. So that's most of our efforts have been focused on that. You can go on the website, writersagainsttrump.org. You can see statements from different people, from the two of us, but from dozens and dozens of others. And we are planning events on November 5th, so next Thursday, 2 days after the election day, when we're almost convinced that the election will not have been decided. I think it's very unlikely that we'll know who has won. And the question, I'm going to be running the national event. We have local events throughout the day. In the evening, there's a national event, and I'm going to be the host, and there'll be 3 writers. You'll know Salman Rushdie is one, and then a poet, Natasha Trethewey, and a essay writer, Rebecca Solnit. And so the 4 of us will be discussing these questions. These are the questions we are asking all the people who participate. What just happened? What is happening now? What should happen next? And I understand right now the whole situation is so uncertain that I can't even begin to write my introduction until the day of the event, because I don't know where we're going to be. It could be that the polls are right and Biden will win by a lot, and there won't be a big issue. It could be, and most likely will be, much closer, in which case Trump has promised to not to accept the results if he loses, and then all kinds of chaos can ensue. I shudder to think. I mean, people are buying guns all over America now. They're preparing. I mean, there could be, I hope and pray not, but some kind of civil war in the streets. And if somehow Trump steals the election, I'm convinced that tens of millions of people will be in the streets. And the things we saw back in the summer will be small by comparison. This will be unprecedented numbers of people protesting, because finally, there are more of us than there are of them. I mean, most people, the majority, do not like Trump, but through the manipulations of the system, they've all maintained power. And it's a truly frightening moment. I think it's probably the darkest period in American history since the end of the Civil War in the 1860s.
Wow. It reminds me that 10 years ago, you were a guest here in Israel of the Jerusalem Writers Festival, and you gave an interview in which you said that looking from outside to Israel, you see like a black, huge cloud sitting over Israel. And you referred, of course, to our political situation. And I think that it's gotten, some people's views, it's gotten worse. So I think everywhere around the world, there are, the political leaders are controversial, to say the least. So can you refer to that? What is happening to the world?
I think what's happening to the world is it's complex. I don't want to simplify it, but I mean, to give you the short answer, the world doesn't work anymore. The systems we've set up, to manage our lives as a planet are not fulfilling the needs of most of the people on the planet. And there's a lot of discontent and a lot of confusion. I mean, things keep changing so rapidly. The global economy that everyone talks about has helped some people and devastated other people. And people get so confused. And then when they're confused, they turn to simple solutions, and they want strong leaders. And the ideas of democracy are less important than feeling safe. And then they turn to the wrong people who make things only more dangerous for everybody. And I think that's why we're in this situation we are now. Because the world is unfair. The world is controlled by, the very, very rich, and money is in charge. It's not concentrated in any one place. It's in many different countries, but there are a few people with most of the wealth, and then everyone else is struggling, and people resent it, and they have every reason to resent it. But there's a lack of political solidarity among the oppressed, and so they become, rather than a group united to change the world, they submit to some kind of authority that they think will protect them, but it doesn't. And I think that's why we have so many terrible leaders around the world now, whether it's in China or Brazil or the United States or Poland or Hungary, everywhere, the Philippines. These are all really sinister men who are doing terrible damage to all their peoples.
Can we finish by going back to literature? Can you tell us about what you're working on right now? And we do have a few questions from the audience. So.
I'll tell you, I've spent the last years working on a book. I'm correcting the proofs right now of the book. It's another big fat book, but it's not a novel. It's a biography and study of the work of an American writer you probably don't even know. His name was Stephen Crane. Stephen Crane lived at the end of the 19th century. He was born in 1871. He died in 1900. He died at 28. But in those 28 years, he wrote extraordinary amounts of work. He's most famous for a novel he published when he was 23, The Red Badge of Courage, which is the only novel about the Civil War in America that's any good. It's a masterpiece. Crane was the first American modernist, and he had a fascinating life, absolutely filled with adventures and strange events. And he worked and worked, and then he died of tuberculosis. And he left behind this extraordinary 3,000 pages of published work. And I got so interested in him. After I finished 4321, I was not writing. I was taking some time off. I started reading different books by different people. And I went back to reading Crane. I hadn't read him in many years. And I understood how great he is, how extraordinary, powerful writer he is. And so I thought, I'll write a nice little book about Stephen Crane to show my appreciation, maybe 200 pages. Well, the book is 800 pages, and it's big, but there was a lot to say. There was a lot to say, because it's, on the one hand, I'm telling the story of his life, but I'm also reading the work. I'm looking at the works, because I assume that many of them, none of my readers will know these works, and I'm sort of leading them through how these things, what the effect of these works is. So it was a great thing to do. And I kept asking myself, why am I doing this? Why am I writing this kind of book? I've never done this before. And this is really not a comical answer. It sounds funny, but at a certain point, I realized that Stephen Crane was Ferguson 5. He was but a real person, you see, and there was a certain satisfaction in that discovery, because believe it or not, even though Stephen Crane was the son of a Methodist minister, he was born in Newark, New Jersey also, just as I was, and just as the Fergusons were, and so was Stephen Crane. Make of that what you will, but it's very—
It was meant to be.
Yes, very interesting. So, you want to do questions?
We had a couple of questions here, but I think we already answered them. People are curious whether to what will happen the election next week.
Uh-huh.
And another one would like to know about your decision to name your novel with numbers. And I think we also refer to that.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. So, well, you can ask me one more then if you want, or we can just say goodbye, whatever you want to do.
There's another question. Will you ever write another book similar to the New York trilogy?
I doubt it, because how is that possible? I wrote that book almost, well, let's see. I think I finished it 37 years ago, something like that. 36 years ago. I'm not the same person anymore. Why would I want to write a book similar to any other book that I've written? I want to keep finding new things to do. And that's the adventure of doing this. No, so definitely there'll be no more New York trilogies.
Okay, so I would love to say thank you so much, Mr. Oster, for a lovely conversation, and thank you for being again so generous and nice.
Thank you.
And good luck with the election next week.
Yes, we're going to need it. Thank you very much. Good luck in Israel too, and all the best. And thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.